Well, looking at this excerpt from Parfit's book, and looking at this reading, I think that there are two natural questions that a reader might have. First, who is this S theorist, and what does S stand for? Secondly, what is the meaning of this word, or these sets of words, this set of words, rationality, irrationality, rational, irrational? Well, it turns out the two questions are directly related. If we look at other parts of Parfit's book, and I have not read Parfit's book, I'm just looking at different sections of it, the S theorist is the self-interest theorist. And it turns out that this theory is a theory of rationality. Let me read you something from the beginning of Parfit's book. He says, I shall first discuss the self-interest theory, or S. This is a theory about rationality. S gives to each person this aim: the outcomes that would be best for himself and that would make his life go for him as well as possible. Now, a little bit later, Parfit says something else about the S theorist. He says, I can now restate the central claim of S, the self-interest theory. This is, for each person, there is one supremely rational ultimate aim, that his life go for him as well as possible. So there's something quite compelling about that. I mean, or maybe it seems quite true about that. That the self-interest theorist, his theory has a theory of rationality, of what it is rational to do and what, I guess, by implication, it's irrational to do. And all the S theorist is saying is that each one of us should do what would make his or her life best. That is, the choices that we make. We have an ultimate aim here, that our lives go as well as possible. So in the choices that we make, if those choices are to be rational choices, that we should make the choices that, in our best estimation, our best guess, will have the best outcomes for us. And that means that they will make our life go as good as it can go. It seems quite compelling. I mean, as we think about the choices that we do make, we assume that the best choice is the choice that will make our life go best. And an irrational choice would be to willingly, knowingly do something that would make our life go worse. Mundane choices. Say that you were looking for a new car and you had narrowed the choice down to two different models, and they cost exactly the same, and in fact, in all relevant respects, were exactly the same, except for one feature. You discovered that one of the models' car got significantly better gas mileage than the other. All things being equal, if these cars were in every relevant respect, price and features and all the different things I guess you look for in a car, were exactly the same, except that one got significantly better gas mileage, it would be rational, I think, I would say, to buy that one. And it would be irrational to buy the one that got the worst gas mileage. I think that that's an example of what we would call rationality, or rational choice. That is, that when we have a firm idea of what would be better for us, and that it would be irrational to choose something else. So you could say that if you're committed to rationality in this respect, in the S theorist's respect, you're committed to the idea that we should do those things that, on the whole, make our life better, and then we should avoid those things that make our lives worse. So what Parfit is interested in I think, on the whole, is how the question of time, temporal relations, figure into this idea of rationality. And his first example is quite interesting. It's the one about waking up in the hospital this is purely hypothetical, purely made up, waking up in the hospital in a very peculiar position, let's say. You know that you are there to get an operation. You've had this sort of operation before, and it's a very painful operation. You have to remain awake during the operation and feel all the pain that goes along with it, but that you will have induced amnesia after the operation to wipe out any painful memories of it. So you wake up in the hospital, and knowing all this, you cannot be sure that whether or not you've had the operation already or whether the operation is to come. So you ask the nurse, and she says, well, she doesn't know which patient got the operation, but she knows that one patient had the operation yesterday, and it lasted 10 hours, and it was really bad, 10-hour painful operation. And then another patient is slated to have the operation later today, I believe, and it will only last 1 hour. So she goes out of the room to find out which one you are. And what Parfit is interested in is your state of mind as you're waiting to hear the news. That is, which patient do you want to be? That is, do you want to be the patient who had 10 hours of suffering yesterday, or do you want to be the patient that will have 1 hour of suffering in the future? And the answer, I think, Parfit's answer is very plausible. That is that, well, at least he, and he believes probably everybody, would rather be the patient who had the 10 hours of suffering yesterday rather than the patient who will have the 1 hour of suffering in the future. Now, the question is, and his question is this irrational? Because if you look at it one way, of course, I mean, that is, if we look at it in what he says is the temporally neutral way, then it would be absolutely ridiculous, irrational, to choose 10 hours of suffering in your life over 1 hour of suffering in your life. That is, I mean, if we just put it that way, would you like, say you're choosing between two different lives, would you rather be the person who has 10 hours of suffering or the person who has 1 hour of suffering? You just look at it like that, I think it's clear that you'd rather be the person who has 1 hour of suffering. But in the position of the person in the hospital, it's as if they are choosing to be the person who has 10 hours of suffering rather than the person who has 1 hour of suffering. And so, look at it in certain ways, clearly irrational. But what Parfit is interested in is how our temporal relation to that suffering, that is, whether that suffering is in the past or the future, makes a huge difference on how we regard it. So he believes that it's clearly it's not irrational to choose to have the 10 hours of suffering rather than the 1 hour of suffering, as long as that 10 hours of suffering is in the past and that 1 hour of suffering is still to come. He says, for instance, I would prefer, this is on page 195, I would prefer my life to contain more hours of pain, if that means that none of this pain is still to come. And says, most of us would have my preference. So that's really the first point that he makes here, and that raises some very interesting questions, I think, about rationality and about the way that we view the experiences in our lives.